So today we are diving into a pretty massive story. I mean, Elon Musk is publicly claiming that the South African government is straight up blocking his satellite internet network, Starlink.
Right, and it's not just a quiet regulatory dispute.
No, not at all. He put out this massive social media blast claiming he's being shut out of the country because he is, quote, not black.
Yeah, which obviously turned this into an absolute firestorm online almost immediately.
Exactly. So for you, the listener, we are looking at this really high-stakes standoff here. You've got the world's wealthiest guy, a fleet of low Earth orbit satellites, and a sovereign nation that is just, enforcing policies that are deeply rooted in its history.
It really is this profound collision. I mean, you have this sort of frictionless, borderless model of Silicon Valley tech monopolies crashing right into the incredibly rigid, historically burdened frameworks of a localized nation state.
Right.
And this whole debate is basically functioning as a lightning rod now for these huge global arguments about corporate sovereignty, economic reform, and really who dictates the terms of our digital future.
Yeah, it's huge. But before we go any further, I want to explicitly set the ground rules for you listening today regarding how we're tackling this deep dive.
Which is super important given the context.
Very important. We are navigating highly politically charged terrain here. The underlying topics involve race, national regulation, and the structural economic policies built right after apartheid.
Yeah, heavy stuff.
Extremely. So we want to make it unequivocally clear that we are not taking sides. Our sole objective today is to neutrally unpack the mechanics of this dispute. We're just going to lay out the arguments from both the supporters and the critics exactly as they are detailed in our source material.
We're just mapping the territory here, not endorsing any specific viewpoint.
Precisely. We are just the messengers.
And honestly, that neutrality is critical because the rhetoric around this has gotten so intensely polarized. I mean, it completely obscures the actual bureaucratic and legal mechanics of what is actually happening on the ground.
Right, it gets lost in the noise. Okay, let's unpack this. To really understand Musk's claim, we have to look at the specific policy he's actually targeting.
Yeah, the whole friction point centers on South Africa's BE policies.
Which stands for Black Economic Empowerment, right?
Exactly.
So for an international business that just wants to, enter the South African market, what does BE compliance actually demand from them structurally?
Well, at its core, BE is this macroeconomic legal framework. And it was designed to structurally transfer wealth and economic control to historically disadvantaged individuals.
Okay.
So for the telecommunications sector specifically, the rule is that to get a national operating license, a company has to demonstrate a specific threshold of ownership.
Ownership, okay,
Yeah.
not just employees.
Right, exactly. It is usually set around 30%. And that 30% has to be held by historically disadvantaged groups.
Huh.
Yeah, I mean, it is not an employment quota, like you said. It's a strict equity mandate. The government requires this localized transfer of capital ownership in exchange for letting you access their market.
Which really explains the polarized camps we are seeing in the public reaction, right? Like, Musk's supporters are pointing to this 30% equity mandate and just flat out labeling it an explicit racial barrier to entry.
Right, they see it as highly discriminatory.
Exactly. They look at a tech company offering this really modernized service, and they see it being denied a license solely based on the demographic makeup of its global ownership structure.
Yeah, and then the critics counter that completely. They point out that BEE is a non-negotiable legal mechanism for economic redress.
Right.
You have to remember, the South African telecommunications sector is highly lucrative.
Highly.
So critics argue that letting a massive foreign entity just extract capital from the domestic market without integrating into that post-apartheid economic restructuring.
It undermines the whole point.
Exactly. They say it fundamentally undermines national sovereignty and the entire project of structural economic equality.
It kind of reminds me of a venue implementing a strict Boer policy, right? Like a club that has intentionally excluded certain people for years and years.
Oh, that's an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah, and now the new management says, look, to fix this, we have strict house rules about who gets equity and access moving forward. So the pushback I would have is, is Musk genuinely facing discrimination here? Or is he just flat out refusing to navigate the required house rules of a country that's actively trying to fix its past?
Right, and that is the exact tension. The dispute is fundamentally about the mechanics of compliance.
Because SpaceX is not going to just hand over 30% of its company, right?
That's exactly. SpaceX isn't going to dilute its global multi-billion-dollar corporate equity just to meet a 30% local ownership threshold for one single regional market.
But wait, how do other massive multinational tech firms do this then? Because, I mean, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, they all operate heavily in South Africa.
They absolutely do.
And they aren't handing over 30% of their global parent companies, are they?
No, of course not. The standard corporate playbook involves creating localized structures. So a multinational will typically establish a South African subsidiary.
Oh, I see.
Or they enter into a joint venture with a local BEE-compliant consortium. They essentially create this ring-fenced domestic entity that holds the operating licenses.
So the parent company stays intact.
Right. The local partners hold the required equity in that specific local subsidiary, which fulfills the legal mandate, while the parent company keeps its broader global structure untouched.
Okay, so it sounds exactly like an aviation airspace rights issue to me.
How do you mean?
Well, a foreign airline can fly its planes all over the globe, right?
Yeah.
But the moment it wants to land at a sovereign airport, use the local infrastructure, and actually sell tickets to domestic citizens, it has to negotiate landing rights.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It has to partner with local ground crews, obey the civil aviation authority of that specific country. It seems like Starlink wants to operate in the airspace, but is just totally unwilling to negotiate the landing rights through the standard local subsidiary model.
That analogy hits the underlying friction perfectly, actually, because Starlink's entire business model is based on intense vertical integration.
Right, they do everything themselves.
Exactly. SpaceX builds the rockets, they manufacture the satellites, design the user terminals, and manage the network. They prefer to control the entire stack globally.
So sharing control is just not in their DNA.
Right. Carving out a localized equity-sharing joint venture introduces administrative friction and shared control, which just runs completely counter to their standard operating procedure.
Which really transitions us from the broad social media rhetoric to the actual regulatory bodies enforcing these rules on the ground.
Right, the actual bureaucrats.
Yeah, so the Independent Communications Authority of South Africa, or ICASA, they have pushed back really aggressively against this narrative that Starlink is banned.
Yeah, they really don't like that word.
Bureaucratic officials are stating that Starlink simply hasn't completed the necessary legal compliance applications, the same applications that literally every other localized or international ISP manages to file.
What's fascinating here is that ICAS's position is purely administrative. I mean, from their perspective, there is no targeted blockade against Elon Musk at all.
They're just holding up a clipboard.
Exactly. The regulator oversees this whole matrix of compliance that goes way beyond just the BEE ownership thresholds.
Like what else?
We are talking about strict national infrastructure standards, cybersecurity protocols, and crucially, spectrum allocation.
Okay, let's delve into that mechanism for a second, because the term spectrum allocation often just gets brushed off as, boring administrative red tape.
Right, but it's not.
No, it's actually the physical lifeblood of the technology. I mean, low Earth orbit satellites still have to interface with sovereign territory to function, don't they?
They absolutely do. I mean, the internet isn't just magically raining down from the sky independently. To provide that stable, high-speed, low-latency internet, LEO satellite constellations require specific radio frequency bands to transmit data back and forth to the receiver dishes on the ground.
And those frequencies belong to the country.
Exactly. Radio spectrum is a finite, highly regulated national resource. Every single country fiercely protects its spectrum to prevent interference between military comms, emergency services, aviation, and commercial telecom.
So a company can't just start blasting a massive commercial signal into a country's sovereign radio frequencies without asking permission.
No, absolutely not.
And furthermore, don't these satellite networks usually require terrestrial gateways too? Like physical ground stations connected to the local fiber optic backbone to route the data?
Yes, you cannot bypass the physical ground infrastructure entirely. Even if you're beaming a signal from a satellite, that data eventually has to hit a local network hub to connect to the broader internet.
Right.
And once you're building ground stations and requesting exclusive commercial radio frequencies, you are operating a domestic telecommunications network, period. And under South African law, operating a domestic network triggers the full spectrum of ICASA licensing, which of course inevitably triggers the BEE equity mandates.
So we have this...
Yeah. Tech monopolies often attempt to leverage the sheer popularity and utility of their products to force regulators into retroactive accommodations.
Like Uber did with taxi medallions.
Exactly like that.
Yeah.
The gamble is that the public demand for the technology will eventually outweigh the political will to enforce complex, localized compliance laws.
Okay, let's shift our focus to the actual macroeconomic stakes of that gamble. Because while the billionaires and the regulators are in this huge geopolitical staring contest, there is a very tangible cost for the everyday people on the ground.
Oh, massive costs.
We really need to examine the economic friction between legacy telecommunications and satellite leapfrogging.
Right, because the African continent generally, and rural South Africa specifically, faces profound connectivity deficits.
Huge dead zones.
Yeah. And expanding terrestrial broadband like physically trenching and laying hardware across vast, rugged, or sparsely populated terrain is incredibly capital intensive.
It's just too expensive.
It's exactly. Legacy telecommunications companies operate on profit margins that make rural expansion economically unviable in a lot of regions.
So the LEO satellite model inherently neutralizes that geographical friction entirely.
Completely.
You just bypass the state-owned legacy grids and the massive physical infrastructure costs. I mean, you're basically dropping a high-speed digital superhighway straight from the sky into a remote village.
That's a great way to put it. A user in a remote agricultural community simply installs a terminal and instantly taps into gigabit speeds.
It's life-changing.
The developmental potential for regional healthcare, digital education, and just integration into the global e-commerce ecosystem is staggering.
Which is obviously the core argument utilized by the supporters of Starlink's immediate entry.
Yes, exactly.
They argue that internet access correlates directly to GDP growth. So by allowing an administrative dispute over localized corporate equity to delay this transformative technology, they argue South Africa is actively stalling its own economic development.
Right. They're saying that maintaining ideological purity regarding corporate ownership is actually exacerbating the digital divide.
So here is my pushback. If the ultimate goal of Black economic empowerment is to lift marginalized communities into the modern economic sphere, isn't blocking the very technology that could instantly connect them totally counterproductive?
I mean, that is the million-dollar question.
Like, does rigid adherence to historical equity policies actively harm the very populations they are designed to empower?
Well, the critics of Starlink's approach offer a fundamentally different economic calculation there.
Okay, what is their angle?
Their argument is rooted in the long-term structural health of the economy. They point out that telecommunications is not just a service, it is a massive engine for domestic wealth generation.
Right, it prints money.
Exactly. So if you allow a foreign monopoly to capture the rural telecommunications market without transferring any equity or ownership to the domestic population, you are recreating historical patterns of resource extraction.
Wow. So it is the digital equivalent of a foreign mining company pulling resources out of the ground and taking all the profits offshore.
Exactly the parallel critics draw.
That is wild.
The technology might be modern, but the economic dynamic is colonial, at least from their perspective. The critics argue that true economic empowerment isn't just having access to a high-speed connection.
It's owning the pipes.
Right. It is having an ownership stake in the infrastructure providing that connection. Handing over the keys to the digital economy to a foreign entity without securing structural domestic equity is viewed as a total capitulation of national sovereignty.
The tension there is just agonizing. It really is a choice between immediate microeconomic connectivity for individuals versus long-term macroeconomic equity for the nation.
Yeah, it's a brutal trade-off.
And this specific tension in South Africa is clearly acting as a microcosm for a much larger global debate about internet sovereignty. I mean, this isn't just an isolated dispute at the bottom of the African continent.
Oh, far from it. If we connect this to the bigger picture, we are really witnessing the evolution of the sovereign internet concept.
Explain that a bit more.
Well, historically, internet infrastructure was largely physical and geographically bound.
Right, cables in the ground.
Exactly.
Right.
Governments could easily regulate the cables and the terrestrial data centers. But low Earth orbit satellite networks represent a total paradigm shift.
Because they're in space.
Right. They introduced the capability for a single, centralized foreign corporation to provide critical infrastructure globally, potentially bypassing domestic censorship, localized taxation, and sovereign regulatory frameworks entirely.
And when connectivity underpins literally everything, banking, emergency services, logistics, government operations, the internet transitions from a consumer product to a matter of critical national security.
Exactly.
The prospect of a single billionaire holding the kill switch to a nation's digital nervous system has got to be terrifying to sovereign regulators.
Which naturally brings us to the political motives potentially driving the public rhetoric here.
Right, because Musk knows what he's doing.
Analysts point out the unique dynamic of Elon Musk's personal history. Being born in South Africa provides him with a highly specific native context for these policies.
He grew up there, he knows the history.
He does. He understands the historical weight of BEE perfectly well.
Yet he chooses to summarize a highly complex, multi-layered macroeconomic restructuring policy into a reductive, explosive soundbite about being blocked because he is not black.
Yeah.
It's a very calculated reduction. So what does this all mean? How are countries supposed to balance this?
Well, observers suggest he is deliberately utilizing his birth country's specific racial policies as a high-profile proxy battle in a much wider global ideological war.
A proxy war, right.
Musk has been highly critical of corporate diversity, equity, and inclusion mandates, as well as ESG regulations globally.
Very vocal about it.
So by highlighting the friction in South Africa, he creates this vivid, controversial case study to argue against structural equity mandates across the board.
He is basically using the regulatory gridlock as a megaphone to argue that social policy inevitably throttles technological innovation.
That's exactly the argument he's making.
However, critics strongly warn that weaponizing South Africa's fragile racial history for a global tech deregulation argument is incredibly reckless.
Yeah, they argue it is dangerous.
It strips a complex mechanism of economic redress of all its historical context and turns it into a partisan talking point, which, honestly, probably only hardens the resolve of the local regulators.
Oh, absolutely. The more aggressive and politicized the public rhetoric becomes, the harder it is for bureaucratic entities like ICASA to offer any compromises.
They can't look weak?
Right. Regulatory bodies do not want to be seen as capitulating to the public demands of a foreign billionaire, especially on policies that are foundational to the ruling government's political identity.
So we have to look at the practical reality of where this leaves us. Based on the geopolitical analysis we are reviewing, there seem to be only two viable paths forward to actually resolve the gridlock.
Yeah, two distinct paths.
The first path is structural adaptation by the tech company. What does that look like?
Adaptation means SpaceX decides the South African market, and potentially the precedent it sets for the rest of the African continent, is lucrative enough to warrant altering their business model.
Okay, so they cave.
Basically, they would identify compliant local partners, establish a joint venture, transfer the requisite equity to historically disadvantaged investors, and quietly file the ICASA paperwork.
They would capitulate to the sovereign reality of the ground they're trying to cover. They would just build the local subsidiary like Google and Amazon do.
Exactly.
What is the alternative?
The alternative is sustained escalation.
Uh-oh.
Starlink refuses to alter its global corporate structure, and the South African government refuses to grant an exemption to its bedrock economic policies.
So nobody blinks.
Nobody blinks. The dispute transitions from a regional licensing delay into a definitive geopolitical precedent. Global investors and other developing nations are watching this exact standoff to see who backs down first.
It becomes the ultimate test case for whether the sheer velocity and utility of modern technology can successfully overrun the structural borders of the nation-state.
It really does.
So to bring the scope of this deep dive back into focus for you listening, this is not simply a dispute about an inflammatory tweet.
No, not at all.
Nor is it some mundane squabble over bureaucratic processing times.
It is a fundamental stress test of global telecommunications policy. We are watching a sovereign nation attempt to enforce legacy legal frameworks designed to heal a fractured past upon a technology explicitly designed to ignore physical and political boundaries entirely.
The digital cloud inevitably has to anchor itself to the physical ground at some point. And when it does, it collides with the dense, complicated reality of human history and sovereign law.
Beautifully said.
Thank you. Well, we want to leave you with a final provocative thought to consider as you navigate the rest of your day. As high-speed internet transitions from a luxury into a fundamental pillar of human economic survival, should multinational tech monopolies be compelled to integrate into the complex historical and social policies of every individual nation they orbit? Or, as connectivity moves into the stars, does the sky demand an entirely new architecture of global governance?